15th of April 1966 edition of Time magazine featured a cartoon on its front cover, drawn by Punch illustrator Ralph Steadman. The cartoon was a collage incorporating traditional London symbols, such as Big Ben, a red double-decker Routemaster bus, a Union Jack, and the Houses of Parliament. Yet it also included the new symbols of meritocratic London, the Beatles in a pink Rolls-Royce, the Ad-Lib discotheque, The Who, the Rolling Stones, some Kings Road mini-skirted dolly birds, and an E-type Jaguar, and a caricature of the newly re-elected Labour Prime Minister Harold Wilson, who, having taken a gamble on calling the general election in March 1966, won a 96-seat majority over the Conservatives. Harold can be seen here smoking his habitual pipe on the cover, supposedly a symbol of the working class, even though everyone in the know knew that he smoked cigars in private. Wilson first came to office aged 48 when Labour won the general election in 1964, which compared to previous Conservative Prime Ministers made him look positively young, if not trendy. Although his northern accent and nominating the Beatles for their Member of the British Empire MBE Awards in 1965 obviously helped him to appear at least a little fab. All four Beatles were made members of the British Empire for services to British industry, or perhaps that should have been services to the British economy. The Fab Four had brought millions into the British economy, but some commentators cynically suggested that giving the Beatles MBEs was more of a PR stunt by Harold Wilson to earn favour with younger voters. Government by gimmick, Wilson's critics claimed at the time. Offshore ship-based pirate radio was so successful in the so-called Swinging Sixties, it forced the BBC to create Radio 1 and Parliament to legalise commercial radio. Irishman Ronan O'Reilly landed in London as a young man, determined to break away from the wealthy family shipping background, and determined to bring more music to more people. He was aware of the fact that the UK government would not permit a land-based radio station playing pop music. So he acquired a ship and some American jingles and began to equip it. He saw a picture in a magazine of President Kennedy playing with his daughter. Radio Caroline was named in that instant. And so reads the rosy-tinted retrospective fairy tale version of the origins of Radio Caroline and offshore pirate radio. In an interview with BBC Radio 1's The Story of Pop, broadcast on the 26th of January 1974, Ronan O'Reilly said, "It was part of the revolution. It was the thing that was in their homes every day. It was the realisation it was a little ship and a bunch of young people doing it against the entire sort of forces of the establishment. And I think totally revolutionised the music scene. And it established in people's heads, once and for all, that people wanted to listen to music anytime they wanted to listen to music, day or night." Pirate radio was seen as being part of the 60s revolution in Britain. Yet it wasn't the stuffy old reactionary conservatives who opposed them. In fact, it was the person with the quaint title of Postmaster General between 1964 and 1966, who was responsible for the administration of broadcasting in the UK, who was vehemently opposed to the pirate radio stations. that person being the Labour government's darling of the left wing of the party, Tony Benn. In contrast to the revolutionary image of pirate radio, reflecting in a later BBC documentary, Tony Benn thought they might have actually helped the establishment at a time of great social and political turmoil. Benn stated, "The other side of the 60s, which was the anti-Vietnam War movement, the challenge to the established order, were never reflected on commercial radio or pirate radio. They just continued to pump out the music. And in a way, the establishment came to like the pirates because they offered what I think they realised they had to concede: unlimited pop culture and sexual liberation as a way of diverting and diffusing the pressure for social change." Talking of toffs and the aristocracy, the funding of offshore stations came from a curious mixture of American capitalists and affluent British people. Notably Jocelyn Stevens, who donated substantial funds to Radio Caroline while editing Queen magazine, whose contents could fairly be described as the public school set at play. Incidentally, there's several versions of how Radio Caroline got its name. One that Ronan O'Reilly named it after President Kennedy's daughter, another being the name Queen magazine gave its targeted reader, Caroline, the good time girl who Clement Freud described as non-intellectual who one ended up in bed with. But friends of O'Reilly said it came from his then girlfriend, Caroline Maudling, who wrote a travelling teenager column in the politically right-wing Daily Mail newspaper, who was the daughter of the Conservative Chancellor of the Exchequer, Reginald Maudling. On the surface, the pairing of a director of an offshore pirate radio ship with a daughter of a senior Tory politician who wrote a column for Britain's most right-wing newspaper may seem rather extraordinary. But nothing about the Swinging Sixties was, as it first appeared, or was depicted, then or now. The offshore pirate radio ships, who started broadcasting at a time when the BBC had only a few hours a week of pop music, in heavily scripted and highly produced shows, with the only other radio outlet targeting the British pop-loving audience being the evening's only crackly Radio Luxembourg, whose output was dominated by programmes sponsored by and consisting only of releases from the big four record companies, basically payola. So there was obviously a huge commercial gap and opportunity for offshore pirate radio ships. The pirate radio ships played music the BBC didn't play, and for longer, but they were mindful not to broadcast anything that might upset their commercial investors, or anything that might result in losing advertising revenues. Radio Caroline began broadcasting on Saturday, 29th of March 1964. By the end of April 1964, Advertisers, realising the huge size of Radio Caroline's audience and the apparent absence of any official action against the station, were beginning to lose their initial inhibitions about buying airtime. Bizarrely, the very first commercial on the station, aired on the 1st of May 1964, was for Woburn Abbey, a stately home which was opened to the public by its owner, the Duke of Bedford, in 1954. The Duke needed money to pay off death duties, and so opening up his stately home and charging the public an entrance fee helped generate much needed revenue. The Duke reported increase in attendance immediately after transmission of the Radio Caroline commercial. In case you haven't made the connection, that's the Duke of Bedford, otherwise known as the Marquis of Tavistock, as in Tavistock Institute, the same Tavistock Institute that the 11th Duke of Bedford gave a building to, in order to enable the study of the effects of shell shock on British troops who survived World War I. Please check out my Tavistock's Flower Children video if you're interested in what the Duke of Bedford was up to in the Summer of Love 1967.